Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today we'd like to welcome Andrea Durbin, Margot Pierce, and Sherilyn Cortez. They're going to talk to us today about the Pan-Canadian Framework on Sexually Transmitted and Blood-borne Infections. From now on, I'm just going to say STBBI because that's a mouthful, so we'll proceed forward that way. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the circle and what we do here. So as a quick reminder to everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If that's you for today for this conversation, I urge you please utilize your support networks. Talk to a friend, elder, family, counselor, whatever it is that you need, make sure that you're accessing that care. So quick introductions on our end before we get started. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chelwithel First Nation. I'll be kind of facilitating the session today. So for the most part, I'm just going to be kind of sitting and listening. Other Learning Circle team members in the room today, but off camera, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our production assistant, or program assistant rather. So with that kind of all done, wrapped up, I'm going to pass the mic over to you guys. Would you mind introducing yourselves?
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks, Cole. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherilyn Cortez. Maayongaga, that's good morning in the dialect of my parents who are originally from the Philippines. Came to Turtle Island here in the 70s, and I was born on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, also the homeland of the Métis Nation, also known as Winnipeg, but now living here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Very grateful for that. And I'm a nurse working with the Indigenous Wellness team with First Nations Health Authority. I get to work with these lovely people. Thank you.
Thanks, Cortez. You'll hear me call her Cortez. So.
Yeah, and this is Derbs.
Yeah.
And Margs.
My name is Andrea Durbin, also known as Derbs. It's an honor to be here. My title is Clinical Nurse Specialist, HIV Hep C at the First Nations Health Authority. But really my job is to hold up Indigenous voices and to support our Indigenous Wellness team at FNHA. My ancestors are from the Orkney Islands in Scotland and Ireland, and my family, we have the honor and privilege of working and playing and living in unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people. Both my kids are out here at UBC. Oh. So they asked if they could come, and I said no. But anyways, thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Margot Pierce. I am from Kenora, Ontario, which is on Treaty 3 territory, and but I've been out here in beautiful the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people for, close to 20 years now. And I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the BC Centre for Disease Control in partnership with First Nations Health Authority. And I'm super excited to be here and contribute to this really interesting conversation.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we'll get started here.
All right, so we've done acknowledgement.
And our offices are located in Vancouver, so the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
Great, thank you. Okay, so folks can see that slide. Great. All right, so we so just to be clear that we want this to be really informal. The reason why we're here is to hear back from community, and so this will be a fairly relaxed learning circle, if you will. A quick outline is we're going to talk about why we're here. We want to make sure that we're clear on definitions and perspectives on health and wellness. We'll talk about the definition of indicator. What does that mean? What does it look like? We'll talk about, as Cole said, this STBBI framework for action. It's a Canadian one, and it's actually driving this conversation right now. So we'll talk about that framework. And then the most important reason why we're here is because we're looking for feedback from folks in the world of computers and phones. I'm really old. I don't know how this works. But anyways, we're looking for feedback from community on these indicators. Thanks, Cortez. Okay, so why are we here? Well, there are 3 reasons why we're here. Number 1, we know that First Nations people, Indigenous people in Canada are disproportionately represented or overrepresented, if you will, in the indications of, the incidence and prevalence of sexually transmitted infections. That's a deficit-based way of saying that, in the sense that we're measuring what's not going well, and that means that there are higher cases of syphilis, HIV, Hep C, Hep B, etc. And so we acknowledge that because of colonialism, there is this overrepresentation or disproportionate representation, if you will. And First Nations people are disproportionately represented. So we acknowledge that, and that's one of the reasons why we're here. Number 2 is that we know that when we measure programming, that we decide whether or not the programming itself is doing well. We want to be clear that the purpose of this is not to put the onus on First Nations people. This is to put the onus where it belongs, and that is on the system. And so this is calling a system into accountability and culpability around these discrepancies, around the inequities, if you will. So we wanted to be really clear on that as well. And last but not least, the Public Health Agency of Canada has exhorted us to do this. We know that from the health-related calls to action from TRC that we have been, we look back at the truth, and so part of reconciliation is to go forward in a good way. And what does that mean? That means engaging Indigenous people meaningfully, respectfully, and to listen. So it's a little hard, if you will, to listen in this format, but this is how we want to begin the conversation. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, that's great, Derbs. And I think it's just also to let folks know that at this point in time, across Canada, public health representatives are basically coming up with guidelines and trying to make decisions around what needs to be measured when it comes to public health outcomes. And so we want to kind of change the story a little bit and maybe make it so that it's, like Derb said, it's not just deficit-based, it's more strengths-based. Like, we want to know from you folks, like, what you think is going well, maybe what information isn't being measured, what's being left out of the conversation. And, as a general example, one example of a very typical thing that gets measured is how many people are being tested for Hep C, let's say. How many people know that they are Hep C positive? So that's important to measure for sure, but when those become the only things that you look at, it can become very deficit-based. So for instance, I met a nurse recently, and it's a really amazing nurse. She's been running like a girls group for a couple of years, and now finally these same young women that have been meeting up over time are now coming to see her for care, asking for pap testing, asking for screening around sexual wellness. And so we want to know more about that. These are the things that typically aren't being measured. So we want to know, how many of these kind of community-led initiatives are going on. So just an example of how we kind of want to change the perspective and change the story.
Awesome. Thank you. So we want to start from a good place and a clear understanding about culturally safe care. We want to flag for you that this definition was written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. Again, that the purpose of this engagement is to make sure that from a systems level that we're moving towards culturally safe care, which looks like free from racism, the definition is right there on your screen, free from discrimination, where Indigenous perspectives of health and well-being are held up, are honored, are given not just equal space, but more space. And like Cortez said, that where we're not always looking from a deficit-based, but strengths-based, what is working well, resilience in community that has sustained Indigenous communities for since time immemorial. So we want to make sure that we're on the same page. We want to make sure that we acknowledge the impact of ongoing colonialism. Oops, sorry, I dropped my glasses. An elder has Thank you. Encouraged us to use the word colonialism and not colonization, because often with the term colonization, it feels that it's done. It was something that happened and is done instead of something that continues. And certainly we know that systemic racism continues in Canada, unfortunately. We want to make sure that health providers adopt a humble and self-reflective practice to walk beside Indigenous people on their health and wellness journey. There's a great quote that we have at FNHA, and it's that we've achieved cultural safety when First Nations people tell us we have. And we also know that when we want to be allies, we want to come alongside and support the conversation and ensure culturally safe care, that as allies, we're only there, again, when Indigenous people let us know that we have, that we've made it. It's not something that we can deem about ourselves or our practice. Anything to add?
I was just sort of thinking about culturally safe care in terms of, what we're talking about today, especially around like indicators and measurements and, and how, especially with my background is like in health research, is how we really have to reframe the ways in which we look at health and wellness, especially from the research side of things, and that we need so much help to get there. That within health research, they've often done things in a deficit-based way, actually most of the time, and that we have a really strong responsibility now to change that narrative. And so this conversation is, I think, one of many that are happening across Canada amongst health researchers in like trying to come up with ways in which we can look at health challenges and things that are going really well in health in a way that is culturally safe. And as you were saying, holds up Indigenous perspectives and ways of being and knowing. So thank you for that.
Cool, thanks. Okay, next slide. So this is, we need to acknowledge that we have leaned very heavily on this amazing document that came from the Ktunaxa Nation in southeast BC. We want to give you a little bit of background why the Ktunaxa Nation came up with this. First of all, we love Gwen Phillips, her quote about, "We want strong, healthy citizens and communities. How do we know if we're on the right track?" So Ktunaxa came up with this document, this guiding document, to make sure that there's a useful way of measuring information, and that it's balanced and that it incorporates two-eyed seeing, if you will. So from a clinical, qualitative, quantitative, but also from stories, experiences, cultural context, context of colonialism, ongoing challenges, etc. So essentially they've just outlined that an indicator is what we want to achieve, and it lets us know whether or not we got there. Are we on the right track? So that when the federal government, Public Health Agency of Canada, is getting together this framework, we want to know, are we meeting our goals? And we wanted to invoke a very Indigenous approach. And so that's why we are leaning hard on this Measuring Wellness, this document. It's really guided our conversation to date. And so we wanted to hold up our hands to Ktunaxa and say thank you for sharing this. And there's a link to the document. We really recommend that folks take it, read it, print it. It's on my desk, highlighted, and Anything else, Margot, to say about that?
I'll just say that this document, at least for me, has been a game changer, and mine is also now ragged with use and reading and highlighting and notes. There's so much good information in there about how health and wellness is measured, and I feel like it does a really good job of just like explaining what that means and why it's important. And I go back to it quite a bit, so highly recommend it. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. We again, before we started today, I guess we've already started. We just wanted to make sure that we're rooted in an Indigenous way of knowing and being and understanding wellness. so it's beautifully steeped and grounded in a very holistic way, where there is restoration with self, with creator, with each other, with earth, where we are seen and known and loved as whole people, so where there's spiritual and physical and mental and emotional, and that we are part of a greater community, starting in our families and then our communities onto nation, etc. So we just wanted to acknowledge this First Nations perspective of wellness, and like both of my esteemed colleagues have already said, that we want to make sure that we are coming from a strengths-based approach and not deficit-based. Thank you.
I am really excited to share this model with everyone. For those who may have not seen it or know about it yet, some of you may know about it already, but it is the sexual well-being model that was developed by, not myself, I can't take credit for this, but by my beautiful and genius colleagues on the Indigenous Wellness team. So created by Andrea Medley, and as well as Len Pierre, one of the original Indigenous Wellness team members. So this is part of the content that they create that is by Indigenous for Indigenous. And this is a model that really does look at more of a strengths-based and more of a perspective that includes tradition and culture into a healthy sexuality. And so there's 4 elements to this model. One is protecting communities. Second is healthy relationships. Another element is identity. And then finally, adulthood and rites of passage. So just a brief description of this model is when it comes to protecting communities, cooperation and respect. These are very traditional, long-standing held values by Indigenous peoples, and that it's really essential to protect oneself and also one's community in order to kind of ensure the health for future generations. And so one example of that is, protecting your body, maybe engaging in health screening is one way that you can protect yourself, but also protect your relationships and the people around you as well. And when it comes to healthy relationships is healthy relationships with the people that we love, with our friends, our family, but also with ourselves. So part of that is, talking about consent, talking about healthy boundaries, and self-care. For identity, love and patience, these are real strengths that are often, shown to us when we are visiting communities. And so we recognizing that colonialism has introduced some impacts in terms of how traditional ways of Indigenous people, how they saw themselves, how that has changed over time and been impacted by colonialism. So it's really kind of bringing back the strengths of that perspective. So learning more about how gender was traditionally seen. It wasn't something that was binary, and it wasn't seen as something that was hierarchical traditionally. So kind of going back to those ways and sharing that with other people and the rest of us so that we can learn from that as well. And then for adulthood and rites of passage, again, sexuality was not a shameful thing, right? This was something that was celebrated, and it was celebrated as part of ceremony, as part of culture. So learning more about these ways, the traditional ways, and bringing that back as part of a focus. So it's something as a nurse that this model is especially helpful because, again, our perspective is so kind of based on pathology, on disease, on illness, all the things that can go wrong. And really, we need to celebrate more the things that are beautiful, that are healthy, and the way that we connect with other people. And so one example of how, incorporating this, just a simple way that I do in my practice is, in addition to asking, when was your last STI screen, or what medications are you taking? I'm asking, so how are your relationships?
Mm-hmm.
How are things going? Do you feel safe? Are you happy? Things that we're really, I would say, as healthcare professionals, make us uncomfortable to talk about because we're not used to it. So I think it's time to be uncomfortable and start incorporating that into our practice more. Yeah. So please look that up. You can find this more information about this model on the FNHA website.
And there's a link.
On
this slide.
And we'll include all the links as a follow-up on the webpage.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, great.
Great. Okay, so we continue the discussion around definitions. I actually want to read this note that Margot put into the document, and I find it really helpful. So apologies for reading, but it's important to note that indicators are often used to measure the absence of something or to point out a problem, and that these numbers are often used in a way that was very disrespectful of Indigenous people. And as a result, they have contributed to stigma and discrimination towards Indigenous people. So that is that we keep saying it, we mean it, and this is really our goal, is to move away from that approach. When we look at like what is an indicator, sometimes it's helpful. This is a very biomedical model, and I'll come up with a better one in a second. But an indicator measuring wellness might be vaccination rates. So, for example, we know that I think our measles immunization rates in BC are over 90%. So that we know that the way of interpreting that is that 90+% of kids are protected against measles. That's one way. A way that our Indigenous colleagues have encouraged us to look at indicators like, let's say, of health and well-being in community would be number of language programs, culture and ceremony in community. So those are both indicators. One is sort of a biomedical approach, and one isn't. But both are ways that we can measure the success or the effectiveness, if you will, of a program, or a program.
If I may,
Yes.
Yeah.
It seems to me like, just based on those examples, right, the indicator in and of itself isn't something, like inherently evil. It's just that we need to retool it, and make it fit more in line with the Indigenous culture and Indigenous community values.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? Is that indicators in the past have shown to be deficit-based only because Indigenous communities and cultures have been measured against.
That's right.
Yes.
Colonial cultures.
Yes.
Thanks, Cole. We can go home now.
Yeah.
We nailed it.
You nailed it so
You nailed it.
beautifully,
Cole
Cole.
nailed it. Yeah.
Exactly what you're saying. So, for instance, to your point about how Indigenous communities have been measured against some of these indicators and how it's unfair. So you're right, like an indicator itself, they're quite useful. Like, I think people would agree, it's good to know how much gonorrhea testing is happening. It's helpful for us to know, right? For a number of reasons. It can help us with our programming, help us decide where funding goes. The problem with that, though, is that we know, let's say in a small community, it can be hard to go for testing. You may want that testing, but there might be lots of barriers. Maybe there's people that at the health center that you don't want to see, lots of things. Sometimes we hear too that because of certain communities not having the same access to resources, like the lab is really far away and it involves putting the sample on a plane or a boat. So when we start to measure communities against that, it can be very unfair. Whereas I think what you're saying is that what you're hearing from us is that we want to hear more about the things that are going well that doesn't get measured. So for instance, we were recently visiting a community and an elder spoke. He did our opening and our closing, but also stayed for our whole conversation. And honestly, like some of the main takeaways and the highlights came from what he shared. And I have to say too, it's not just when he spoke, because it reminds me too that that's a very Western and colonial way of looking at things, that people only contribute when they're saying something. It was also, as soon as he walked in, right? It was just his way of being, like his presence. So like maybe what also could be interesting to hear is like, how often are elders involved in conversations around sexual wellness, because it's happening. We're just not measuring it. We're not asking about it. So that's some of the things that we're hoping to hear from you folks, We would love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I will say too that like from a public health policy and program planning and that kind of thing, it's a lot easier to make a plan or build a program based on what's working for people and what's helping and what makes people well and how they're finding strength and that kind of thing than it is to build a program about what's not working. And so when we think of these indicators, these wellness indicators, they're so powerful because it's really strong evidence as to what is working in a community and where we need to put more energy and time.
Yes.
So I really love that about the wellness
That's a good point.
approach.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cole, for
Thank
speaking.
you.
up.
Yeah,
that was really
that's great.
helpful.
Yeah.
Less interesting definitions.
Oh,
Let's
yeah.
turn to. I mean, obviously, data is information that contributes to our knowledge. There can be qualitative data, so interviewing people, collecting stories. And then there's quantitative data, like Cortez said, so the number of gonorrhea tests. That's a great example. He chose gonorrhea. Strategic goals, obviously, what is a goal? Something that's smart and measurable. So, for example, a goal, again, very biomedical, but might be that by 2025, all cases of hepatitis C are known and treated and cured.
Sure.
That might be an example. STBBI, so that's sexually transmitted blood-borne infections, so infections that are transmitted or passed from person to person, either through blood and body fluid or through blood and body fluid. And then, of course, a framework is just a way that to address it. It's a way to hold the information in a way that we can kind of roll it out and make sense. Anything to add? No?
No, I don't
Okay,
think
next
so.
slide, please. All right, so the framework, the framework that we've just, that we are addressing and looking at for the purpose of this discussion and this work is been pulled together nationally. Margot, do you want to talk about how they came up with this framework?
I wonder if Cortez
Sure.
might be the
Yeah, not that I'm an
better
expert, but I
person on
think
that.
how it
Yeah.
makes sense to me is that I think maybe last year or the year before, basically Canada, so the public health officials across the country kind of have created this framework, kind of these overarching goals when it comes to STBBIs. And a lot of it is kind of following in step after the World Health Organization. So they have these, big goals like, let's say one of them is eradicating STIs by a certain year, right? So these are kind of big goals. So what is happening now, and kind of basically why we're here, is that across the country in each province, they are trying to get feedback and engagement from people who are actually working around STBBIs. To find out, okay, what are some of the specific things that we need to track in order to achieve those goals? So that is kind of where we're at now. So they've already decided on their overarching framework, the big goals, and now they want to find the things to measure in order to get to those goals. And so that's why we're here, because I do believe that's actually the first time that where like Indigenous communities at the kind of the frontline level are kind of being engaged at this level to find out what are some things that folks in communities would like to follow, would like to be measured.
Yeah, would like to know more about.
Yeah, I would like to know more
Mhm.
about the
Mhm.
things that are traditionally left out of what is measured, right?
Mhm.
As we mentioned, it is normally deficit and biomedical based.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So whose work is this? So this falls under the realm of public health. So I'm supposed to look at it. Public health and population health are exactly what that is. It's a health program that's designed for a group of people instead of an individual person. An example again, sorry, my immunization background is coming back, but programs of immunization in schools. There could be school health teaching around sexual health. Help me.
Yeah,
Folks.
the same applies to like HIV, like
Yeah.
teaching
Yeah.
education around HIV,
Yeah.
HIV prevention,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The one thing we do want to flag, though, is that the work of public health focuses on the entire spectrum of health and wellness, not just disease eradication.
Mhm.
And so, which is the foundation of the work that we're trying to do.
For sure. And does it also incorporate a lot of like social determinants of health and that kind of
Yes.
thing? So when you think about the health or wellness of a population, you consider actually
context.
the context, exactly.
Mhm.
What's going on behind the scenes that have created either vulnerability or resilience against certain health conditions or challenges that can come up. So that could be everything from like housing and food security and,
Access to health,
totally,
Yeah.
totally.
education.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Thank you for bringing that in
Great.
to the conversation. Okay. So again, why indicators? Well, we want to make sure that, again, putting the onus on the system, not on the clients accessing the system or not accessing the system. So making better policies and making sure that our programs and policies are held truly in accountability. To give us early warning signs of problems, promoting prevention instead of trying to retrospectively go back and fix something, and then revealing issues that have been ignored. And I really like the way that you said it, Cole, about this is an opportunity to think about new ways to address current challenges or even challenges of old. Like we want to, indicators aren't bad for the sake of measuring, but we want to make sure that we're asking the right questions. And we also want to make sure that community knows that these questions are out there being asked, instead of, someone throwing a report on a desk, in 10 years and saying, oh, I went into community and asked all these questions and this is what I found. That is not a good way of doing anything.
That's right.
So anything else to add on this?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Next slide.
I think we're there.
Oh yeah.
What makes a good indicator?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Wow. I have 2 pairs of glasses. One
Sorry,
for
I know.
close-up,
I
one
thought
for...
it was the same one too.
I thought it was...
I
Okay.
remember hitting it.
Yeah, so indicators are good when they measure the issue. And again, the issue needs to be identified, that it's relevant to the people affected, instead of doing more harm and damage to people who are directly affected by what's being measured. Indicators need to be fully transparent and accurate, and it needs to obviously reflect on where we want to go.
And
So-
then we put the good in quotation marks because it is kind of it's not just like there's a perfect good indicator, right?
Yes.
I think that we're also open to hearing about things that we think maybe can't be measured, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's an example of what can't be measured, or that would be a bit more difficult to measure? For instance, like I keep talking about testing rates. Like that is easy to measure because that is tracked. That is automatically captured at a lab as part of their data. So that's like very easy to measure. But there are things that aren't so easy to measure. I guess another example would be in another place that we went to recently. This is more about harm reduction, but a group of mothers have gotten together and they formed a group to support each other around, just to talk to each other about how some of their loved ones are engaged in substance use, and just a way to hear from each other and support each other. And so to me, that's an idea of like a community-led, kind of Indigenous-led approach to supporting people on their healing journey. So it's something that is maybe a bit harder to measure, right? Because that's not being captured automatically into anyone's database. So we're open to hearing about things that maybe still could be hard to measure. So technically wouldn't fall into that traditional, very colonial idea of what a good indicator is. But again, we're trying to expand the idea of what an indicator is. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I have a question coming from obviously not having a research background of my own. What do you mean by the term transparent?
Ooh,
Good question.
that's a great question.
I'm on a roll today.
Wow, you are on a roll today. Postdoc?
Sure. That was my nickname over the weekend.
Yes.
I think sometimes, especially when we think about the way in which, and you guys have really framed it well, in the way in which health or public health and also health research has done things in the past, is often like gone into community and taken a bunch of information without being really clear on why they're taking that specific information and what they're going to do with it and how they're going to interpret it. And so I think when we're talking about transparency, it's really about doing the opposite of all of that and really going in with very clear engagement. First of all, asking people, is it okay if we ask these questions? Are these questions relevant to you? This is how we're going to analyze this information. And is this interpretation, the way we're reading this information, is it correct? it opens up sort of this dialogue and transparency in the way in which health information is used and disseminated, so that we don't contribute to the stigma and discrimination and racism that's been going on for several hundred years now in Canada and in healthcare and generally. So I think when I think about transparency, it's about clarity, it's about ongoing community consent and engagement, and making sure that the indicators that we pick, whether it's chlamydia tests or it's the number of women, accessing a mother's program, or kids going through language programs and that kind of thing, that we're really clear on why we're gathering that information and what we're going to do with it as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think it implicitly adds a degree of accountability there as well, right?
Yeah, that's the implicit part.
Yeah, and I the reason why we're excited about this right now, what we're doing today, is because we want to ask the question: what story would community like to tell? Instead of us going in to say, this is what we think the story should be. So that there's this national framework that wants to look at sexually transmitted blood-borne infections. And so instead of kind of rushing out and doing that, there's this intentionality and space to be humble and transparent, which means we humbly admit that we don't know, right? That we don't know best. We thought, help me, Margot.
No, I think you're saying it beautifully. Like we don't really know what's best. Here's some indicators that we think might be important.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Yes.
And is there a better way to ask these questions or to gather this information as well?
And also, I think what we would like to, the message also that we would like to carry forward to the kind of upper echelons of public health is to also that message that anytime that you're working with Indigenous communities and asking for information is to acknowledge and recognize that is their information, right? It's not about going in, taking information, and then doing what they want with it over here. It belongs to the community, right? It belongs to the people, and to have this constant engagement after and ongoing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to ask that question later, and maybe there's space. You can correct me. Feel free to kind of wait to answer this question later. But where will all of this data end up?
We have a slide, but let's do it.
If we have a slide, we can.
No, I think we should. Yeah.
So basically, as we mentioned, there's the overarching framework that the Public Health Agency of Canada has signed on to, that includes representation from each province. And so now they're at a point where they're wanting more information on what needs to be tracked. And so any thoughts or comments that we receive is going to get moved up to this group called the National STBBI Task Force. That is the name. It includes representation from health authorities from each province, and then from that group it feeds up again to the Communicable and Infectious Disease Steering Committee, and that group is like the kind of public health leadership from each province. So you have people from the Ministry of Health, you have public health officers, medical health officers that sit there, and then feeds up to the grand framework. Yeah, so we do have a slide on that, but that's basically where we're hoping to send this message and your thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for that great question. So we have an example. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So what's the story, for example, with hepatitis C? So we know that hepatitis C, it's a tricky virus. There's lots of cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents and lots of affairs in the hepatitis. Lots of different. Anyways.
Are you talking about genotypes?
Yeah, genotypes. That's what I'm trying to get at.
It's a complicated virus.
It's
there's
a very
lots of genotypes, there's subtypes.
Yeah. Lots of different types.
Yeah, types.
So anyway, so that makes it very a very hard to treat and prevent virus biomedically.
It is curable.
It's
now.
curable. So there is no vaccine still. However, there is a very effective cure. They're called DAAs, direct antiretroviral.
Direct acting
Antiretroviral therapy. That doesn't
There you
matter. But indicators, so we know that Hep C, for example, affects mostly folks that are actively injecting drugs and sharing equipment instead of using clean needles every time. It affects people from countries where it's endemic or common. We know that hepatitis C folks can have it for a long time and not know that they have it. There will be no symptoms or illness flags. Oh boy. And that we know that it's a high risk for liver disease and cancer. So I think 80% of all liver cancers are caused by hepatitis. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, so here are some just examples of indicators that tell a story.
Sure.
Yeah, anything to add?
No, that's great.
Okay.
So, when we think about the story of hepatitis C, we might think about some of the questions that would arise about what's going on with hepatitis C. And so we might think about the story that could happen before, during, and after hepatitis C. Some of the questions that might arise where you might wonder, well, how many people are actually living with hepatitis C? Like, how big of a problem is this? Is it really, affecting that many people? And actually, we know in 2018, for example, in British Columbia, that there are about 54,000 people who are living with hepatitis C infection. So that is like a number. That's sort of a large number, a group of people who are living with hepatitis C. And we also know that hepatitis C, you might wonder what kind of people, like what age groups are mostly affected. And when we look at the age groups of people, we find that it's often people who are born right after World War II ended. So between 1945 up to about 1964, or the baby boomer generation. And so we know that about 60% of people who are living with hepatitis C are born in that generation. And that often that older group of people, that they might not know that they have Hep C until it's quite far advanced. And so that's one of the reasons why we are really trying to support older people to come in and get tested and actually get treatment. One of the questions that might come up is like, well, how many people are actually treating Hep C? And what kind of doctor treats Hep C anyway? Can it be my GP?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's my GP, how many GPs are treating Hep C?
Mm-hmm.
Could my nurse give me that treatment? So these are some of the questions that you might consider. You also might wonder, like, what happens before somebody gets Hep C, or like what's going on in a community before Hep C becomes a growing challenge. And it might be that there aren't enough there's not enough new injection equipment in the community, and so people are having to reuse injection equipment, and so then you get a transmission event happening where people are inadvertently transmitting it to each other. And so you also might wonder, are people going in to get tested, and why not? And that really speaks to what Sherilyn was speaking about earlier around, well, it could be that because many people who have become Hep C positive have a history of using injection drugs, that they feel worried that they're going to be judged about going in to get tested. And so that fear and worry is supported by stigma around Hep C infection, and so they might not want to go and get tested. And so the presence of stigma in a town or a city or a community might prevent people from accessing testing. So see, these are some of the questions that could arise when you're thinking about Hep C and wondering, where do we want to get to with it, and how do we measure if we're getting there? So these are just some examples that we were thinking of with Hep C.
Can we take an example even further? And if we look at the HIV cascade of care in BC, and it starts by measuring testing.
Yeah.
So that means that we're leaving out everybody that's not getting tested. and we're not measuring anything about that. So that's a measurement, in my opinion, my humble opinion, that puts the onus on the person, right? Why aren't you getting tested instead of the system? Well, I'm not getting tested because I don't feel that there is a safe and fair place, or that the clinic is open on Thursdays from 2 to 2:30. I'm being sassy, but you know what I mean, right? So I think that's it's a good way to look at, like, when we do things from a very biomedical model, we're missing a whole part of the information and of the story, of the context that we're not capturing, because we're starting at that one place with an indicator that might not be very useful to community.
That is such a good point. And I think that that really speaks to the fact that indicators, like, you might think, okay, how many people are accessing testing? And then there's also the story, the human story behind that, between, like, well, because people in the hospital treat me like crap, or because, X, Y, and Z. So, like, it's important to have not just the number, but also the human voice, the people stories behind the numbers. I think give a really rich context as to what's going on and why. But that's
last week the three of us were fortunate to be together, doing some trainings in communities, and actually I still think about what you said, Margot. So Margs over here in Derps. But, because we were talking about how there's all these, like, often there's all these, like, novel and new approaches to treating people. Let's say when it comes to Hep C or HIV. For instance, Hep C, there's a new approach called micro-elimination, which is, like, looking at maybe, like, a very small group of people and treating that entire group of people. So, that's not a bad idea. But what you said, Margot, is that what's really important is making sure that your services are safe so that people walk in the door. Like, that's really where it begins. And so, like, another idea maybe for something that we could start to look at as an indicator is, what do people think of your services? Do they find your services safe? That would be, I think, a really important thing to start, like what you're saying, Derbs, to your point, starting back, way back before. We start at that cascade of care that often starts at testing, right? It's like, are people even coming to see you? Do they feel safe?
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. This purpose of this slide is to get folks starting to think about the story of hepatitis C, and think about what are some indicators that might be able to answer your questions. So Margot walked us through the last slide that talked about, in BC, we think there's this, and, this number of people, and testing and cure and blah, blah, blah. But this is the first slide where we wanted to get folks out there online to start to think about what are some indicators that you would like to see around sexually transmitted blood-borne infections.
That's right. Yeah, not just Hep C, but all of
Hep C was just
broadly.
And to be clear, we don't want to kind of go down the Hep C.
No. It was just one example.
Yeah. It's a great example.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do our next slide.
Okay, so this was just back to Cole's question about where does this information go. Right. So again, we have the overarching framework. And so now we're at the level where the national task group in each province is trying to get more information from frontline folks, the folks that are kind of providing care, providing services, trying to find out, hey, what do you think needs to be measured? What do you think we need to start looking at? And then from there, it's going to go to the steering committee, and then from there, it'll go to the Public Health Network Council that's actually going to make a decision on, because what you'll see after is you'll see guidelines come forward in terms of, okay, so now for all folks working in public health or doing work around STBBIs, see that these are the things that we want to start measuring and following. So it has an impact in terms of, like, for an example, as a nurse, what I could see how it impacts my practice is that maybe I start doing screening a different way, or I start having to track certain tests that I'm doing for folks, as an example. Yeah, so it does have an impact on the front line. Yeah.
Yeah, and so kind of in that vein, like another really good example is there's a group of nurses in a regional health authority in BC who actually realized that current indicators that they were working with were actually not measured, were not meaningful to their service for First Nations communities. And so they started to collect their own information. And it looked like my relationship, like, you know, so Sherilyn is my client, and she comes to see me now every Monday and tells me about her weekend. That's something that the nurses have chosen to measure, that relationship, that engagement, that relationship, instead of that she's still not tested. But yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So then our I think it's our third last slide is sorry,
Actually,
Cortez.
had just one more question kind of regarding this. So people fill out these surveys. The surveys then go and hook up with the National STBBI task group. Once that information is passed on through the steering committees and then up to the Public Health Network Council, kind of what happens to all of that survey data? Does that go back to communities? Does that go back to the FNHA to be stored? Does that stay with some council for now and to beyond? What happens to that?
Great question.
That is such an excellent question. In the framework, I believe that knowledge dissemination and translation is a part that needs more fleshing out, and like how information is going to be brought back and when. I think is really important questions that have to be asked. But I'm not sure how it all works in the federal government with data redistribution and such like that. Sherilyn, did you?
One thought that we had is that because basically after this webinar, we're going to send out a survey to folks. It's totally optional, but just to get more thoughts in case you wanted more time to think about what our discussion was today, and you had some ideas about some of the messages we could bring forward in terms of what folks from community want to be measured. So another thought is that we had talked about this, but maybe we could come back and maybe present some of the thoughts that came from the survey and have more of a discussion with folks, just so that we can share it. So it doesn't just end up kind of in this, like, where did my thought go? What did you do with that? So we could do a report back as well.
And I'm also hoping, that's a great question, Cole. I'm also hoping that folks in community, folks on this call today will see their feedback in the framework, in the indicators. I think that would be the ultimate goal, was that what community is telling us, right? We're here to ask, like, what do you want to see to be measured? So our hope and dream is that what community reports back to us will be in the framework and the indicators.
Yeah.
It's a great question, and it's also back to your question about transparency. And
absolutely.
As long as we're, I think as long as we're kind of thinking about that and moving forward with that kind of those goals in mind, I'm sure that it will work out. The one other thing that I wanted to ask about here was kind of okay, so maybe with regard to the session follow-up, absolutely. If there are folks out there, if we get a significant return and people want to continue that discussion, we're more than happy to do that. My question was, is this going to be a one-time event where we're just taking a snapshot of people at this point in time, or is there going to be follow-up surveys? How are we going to continue to engage and hopefully then measure kind of the effectiveness of these new policies and these new frameworks, right? Like, because it kind of relates to the data, like, are they going to hold that data and then collect another round? Do you know what I mean? Or kind of how is that going to work in terms of how we're evaluating the effectiveness of these policies? And if this is a more appropriate question for later on, we can totally wait as well.
I think it is such a good question, and like it comes sort of back to what they're looking at measuring, for example. For example, one of the very biomedical ways in which they measure STBBIs is called incidence, or like new infections.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which we look at new infections is to look at it like over time, because a snapshot is just a really like a cross section of what's going on in a group of people at a certain point in time. But measures like incidence look at what's happening over a long period of time in a population.
Right.
And so there will be some indicators that are reportable on an ongoing basis, like over time. And then I think probably some indicators that might be snapshots of what's going on, for example, in 2020
Right.
or whatever. So I think it will depend on what exactly they're reporting out on.
Good. Okay. Yeah. And I don't mean for those questions to appear combative
Not
or
at all.
accusatory in any
No,
way. It's just,
no.
you know,
It's a good
I want to make
question.
sure that, you know, we're kind of always kind of moving forward in that way. You know, just being very accountable.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
No,
Please.
thank you for that. Yes. Okay. So, well, and I think it's a good segue into this. These are actually guiding principles that were extracted from the national framework. I'm not sure if we mentioned, if we didn't mention, we are happy to report that the national framework did include engagement with Indigenous folks across Canada.
Yeah.
So we're happy to report back on that. And here are some of the guiding principles given to us by that engagement with lots of folks on this framework. One is that engagement has to be meaningful. So like there's reciprocity, that we listen, that we're transparent, that we report back, embracing truth and reconciliation, looking back truthfully at what happened, and our commitment to going forward, again, with the onus on the system, not on community, making sure that we're approaching things in a good way, which is integrated and holistic, that it's culturally relevant. Again, that's for community to tell us if it's relevant. Keeping in mind health equity and human rights. Margot touched on social determinants of health. And we just want to acknowledge that that there is a significant difference between equitable and equal healthcare, and that we want to that for folks that have greater challenges, that face greater challenges, that more support is needed. And again, that's on the system, and that it's multi-sectoral or lots of teams and lots of different approaches and seeing, and that it's evidence-based. So those are the guiding principles that we are embracing.
Great.
Okay. This is my favorite slide. Do you want to talk about it? Because you're kind of the genius behind the slide.
Thanks, Andrea. This is our adaptation of what is presented in the.
It's kind of how,
frameworks.
it's kind of how indicators or the measurements are typically grouped.
Yeah,
They're kind of put into different categories.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Mhm.
It's about so the way in which they try to tell the story of what happens with STBBIs. That's such a mouthful, that
I
acronym.
know.
Even the
Anyway,
acronym.
even the acronym.
It's a bit
Anyway, is we need to know what's happening before people are affected, what's happening when at the time they're affected, and then what happens after. So it's the story before, during, and after STBBIs. And the national framework people put together these themes to try to tell this story. And within that, each theme, there are different ideas or concepts. And so with the context before, this list is what they have come up with. And so I'm just presenting to you what's in the report. But before people are affected by STBBIs, often it's happening within a context where there is a significant amount of stigma and discrimination. And we know from talking to people and from a lot of health research that's out there that this can really prevent people from accessing preventative resources like new injection equipment. It can prevent people from getting tested because there's a sense of shame or low self-esteem when it comes to to possibility even of being exposed to an STBBI. There can also be a lack of community awareness around even maybe the existence of this health challenge, or perhaps a misunderstanding around what these STBBIs are really about. For example, syphilis is one that's kind of confusing and hard to understand why it's still there, and why, how it can affect people over time. And that stigma and community awareness can really then intersect with people's engagement or access to healthcare services. And from what we were talking about earlier, is that access to healthcare services is also really impacted by the quality of those services that are being offered. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if these health services are not culturally safe, this can really create a context in which people are not interested in engaging in care like that. Then we have the point where people might become affected by an STBBI. And here is where we look at, people are starting to get tested, if there is treatment available or cure available, and whether or not there's ongoing care and support for people who are living with an STBBI. And then afterward, what can happen to people afterward in terms of whether or not, the STBBI results in long-term negative health outcomes, or whether or not it might resolve into a positive health outcome is also a way to look at it. It's really important to mention too that, we've put these into sort of these neat siloed categories, but you might already notice that there's a lot of overlap between each of them, and that, stigma might happen at each stage, and so, this is not a neat and tidy way to organize things at all. You might also notice that this is a really kind of deficit-based way of describing what's the story. And so, this is what has been proposed by the Pan-Canadian Framework, and this is what we're hoping to get some more feedback from you all out there on what should be added to these concepts, and are these themes on track or telling the right story? Is that
perfect?
Sound all right?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the part that we're really really interested in. So what do folks want to know about sexually transmitted and blood-borne infections? Not from a clinical point of view, like, anyways, yeah, I have this rash, I want to know what, yeah, that's not, we want to know what people want to know. What do you think would need to be measured or explored in order to find this out? What issues or concerns are important to community? What's important? It might not be any of this, and we need to hear that. And what indicators would help find the answers to the questions? So that, I think, is probably one of the most important questions, is what measures, what do you think would help the system find the answers to questions and concerns that are flagged? Just to be clear, I've flagged this. We want the story to be about how the system recognizes how it's been wrong and failed people, and change so that people feel safe to access healthcare at all levels. Yeah. So I think that's our final slide. Yeah.
Yeah. Then there was after this slide, we do kind of have the slides for the different sections that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if this slide is more useful or if the previous one is more useful to get discussion going.
Because we have context, engagement, and then outcomes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We left it. No, that's good. Yeah.
I think I like that one.
Yeah,
that's good.
Better too.
Yeah.
So we'll give you a few minutes to populate the chat box. If for any reason you don't want to type your response in a public forum, you can always privately message the moderator of the chat. That'll just go directly to me, and you don't need to have your name or identity associated with that question in any way, if that would make you feel more safe. I wanted to say, kind of to cap off the presentation, the conversation that we had today, well, at least the presentation portion of it, is that these kind of opportunities I think are incredibly exciting. You know, I know the great work that you guys do, and I know how hard you all work, and I know how difficult that is, and I'm saying this earnestly, that, you know, the people that are sitting in this room apart from me really are champions, and they work day and night to try and affect positive change within the healthcare system that we find ourselves in. And I think that these kind of these points of open discussion, these points where feedback is invited, it's critical. That data, that's what gives them the tools to do what you would like to see reflected in your healthcare. Without that data, without those responses, it's just anecdotal. It's difficult to get, you know, when we're talking, going back to that slide on kind of, okay, there's this committee and that committee and this committee, you know, 2 or 3 chains removed, that anecdotal story doesn't matter anymore. You know what I mean? The people that are in those meetings aren't going to be moved by one person's story. But if we can fill out, you know, if we can have a robust response to this survey, we can arm the champions with those tools to go to these meetings and say, hey, look at, this is what is needed. This is what the community wants. We have the data to support that it's positive and that it's going to make a great impact. Then that's what's going to exert change. In my opinion, that's what's going to bring about the change that we all want to see. But we need to, you know, it falls on each of us as an individual responsibility to contribute to that system and to contribute to the survey data. So I just wanted to thank you guys very much for coming on and talking about it, because I think it's critical. It's really important. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I do, and thank you. And I do want to say that we acknowledge that if we don't get a lot of feedback from this, that indicates that we have not done our work in finding the best way to engage people.
We need to keep trying
and
keep finding.
And so that we'll keep trying to find ways that work best for folks.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't look like we have any questions or comments at this point. Let me just check the private. No, it doesn't look like we have anything. That's okay. Perhaps, like you said, perhaps it's just not quite the right thing. But we will provide the links to everybody to fill out the survey. If you'd feel more comfortable going away and thinking about it and then responding, that's totally okay as well. We'll have the survey available on our website, and you can find it as you would look up this session normally. So I urge you to take part, and I think at this point I'll give everybody a couple more minutes. I'll do my usual kind of end of session plug, and we'll see if anybody has anything to go on. So coming up in November, as I've mentioned before, we have a lot of other sessions. We have sessions coming up on Indigenous student experiences, as well as we have a lovely language session coming up. We're going to chat with the Dudes Club about healthy masculinity. And then we have Marcia Dawson's going to come and chat with us a little bit about Indigenous leadership and kind of what that can look like within community and within structures. Moving forward into December, we'll have Denise will come back for part 2 of Indigenous healing rituals.
She's awesome.
Yeah. And then we're actually hoping that Andrea Medley and a few other guests will come and chat with us a little bit more about healthy sexuality to cap off kind of our year. And yeah, so look forward to those. Please, if you haven't already done so, register for those on our website. Yeah, so give us one last quick check here.
So cool. If folks have like questions or concerns, they can email someone here, and then you can forward them to us if you are unable to.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
We'll probably, generally speaking, if somebody wants to chat with you guys about it, we'll let them do that.
Perfect.
Just kind of connect those, because you guys are obviously the experts, and we just set up cameras and smile politely. So we'll make sure that you guys get connected. Yeah. So I guess with that's the end of our session today. Thank you all very much for coming and participating. I really appreciated you joining the conversation today. And thank you all again so much for coming on and chatting.
Thanks so much.
And Kaylin.
Thank you, Kaylin and Cynthia.
Thank you.
Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Bye.